January 1943. The sky over southern France was a sheet of dull silver, broken only by thin streaks of exhaust from aircraft that should not have been there. Inside a chilled dispersal hut at RAF Benson in Oxfordshire, a young reconnaissance pilot bent over a wrinkled sheet of paper. Pencil lines crossed like spiderwebs, rivers, roads, shadows, all hand-drawn from memory. His squadron mates called it a child sketch, a fantasy born from too many hours above enemy clouds. But he was certain. Somewhere beyond those lines, hidden beneath rows of pine and camouflage netting, the Luftwaffe had carved out a secret airfield, one the Allies couldn't find in 1,000 reconnaissance photos. Outside, the sound of a Merlin engine idled low and impatient. The pilot folded his paper map once, then again, sliding it into the side pocket of his flight jacket. The air smelled of oil, frost, and coffee gone cold. He pulled his gloves tight, eyes fixed on the horizon that was slowly brightening with war. And with that map trembling in his hand, he walked toward his waiting Spitfire, determined to prove the impossible. The invisible enemy. By early 1943, the war in the air had become a battle of information as much as a clash of steel. The Royal Air Force had clawed its way from the dark days of 1940, when Britain stood alone, to a position of cautious strength. Yet the Luftwaffe remained dangerous, not because of its power alone, but because of how well it could hide. From the skies above occupied France, Allied reconnaissance cameras swept thousands of square miles of countryside every week. Pilots flew unarmed, relying on speed and altitude to survive. Their job was not to fight, but to see, to return with images sharp enough for analysts to find targets that even spies could not describe. But in 1943, those analysts began to notice something alarming. Allied bombers striking railway hubs and coastal depots were often intercepted by German fighters appearing from nowhere. Airfields believed to have been destroyed weeks earlier seemed to resurrect overnight. Squadrons vanished into forests and farmland, beyond the reach of cameras and maps. The Luftwaffe's camouflage engineers had perfected deception. They laid out fake runways of painted canvas, parked wooden aircraft to mislead reconnaissance flights, and built false hangars from timber and wire. From 30,000 feet, even trained eyes could not tell real from fake. It became a silent war of wits, photographers versus illusionists. And the margin of error was deadly. Each misidentified target meant hundreds of airmen flying into traps or empty fields. To counter this, the British formed an elite branch within the RAF, the Photographic Reconnaissance Unit, or PRU. Its pilots were handpicked for calm nerves and sharp vision. They flew stripped-down Spitfires and Mosquitoes, painted pale blue for concealment at altitude, equipped only with cameras. No guns. No armor. Only fuel, film, and instinct. Among these pilots was a young lieutenant known for an unusual habit. He never trusted official maps. He sketched his own after every flight, tracing rivers, roads, and factory roofs with meticulous precision. Others laughed at his obsession, calling it a relic from a bygone era of explorers and cartographers. But to him, paper and pencil were survival. That winter, word spread of a problem deep within occupied France. Intelligence suggested a Luftwaffe base operating somewhere between Tours and Limoges, but every aerial photograph showed nothing but farmland and woodlands. The Allied bomber crews flying over the region reported flak concentrations far heavier than expected, and German fighters seemed to appear from those same forests before vanishing again. The evidence didn't align. Analysts debated endlessly. Perhaps it was coincidence or a decoy operation. But one man, staring at his wrinkled hand-drawn maps, saw something others missed. A pattern of truck tracks, faint but consistent, weaving between two unremarkable villages. He brought the sketch to his commanding officer, proposing that a real airfield might be hidden there, cleverly concealed beneath the tree line. The officer glanced at the crude map, raised an eyebrow, and smiled politely. "Interesting theory," he said. But until you have photographs, it's just lines on paper. The young pilot nodded. But inside, he was certain. He had seen too many odd shapes in the mist, too many shadows that shouldn't exist. That night, under the flickering light of a single bulb, he spread his papers again, piecing together what the official charts had missed. Rivers, roads, wind direction, cloud patterns, every detail drawn from memory. His fingers were numb from cold, graphite smudging across the page. By dawn, he had something that looked nothing like the standard reconnaissance grid, just a tangle of curves, landmarks, and handwritten notes. But it told a story he trusted more than any report. This would become his paper map, the one everyone would laugh at. And yet, in the days that followed, that fragile piece of paper would guide him straight toward one of the most elusive Luftwaffe bases of the war. But before that mission could begin, the world around him, the war itself, was shifting into a new, more desperate phase. These stories aren't just history, they're proof of human courage and sacrifice. If you too salute these heroes, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and become a part of our journey. And don't forget to tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Let's continue the story. By February 1943, Allied intelligence had become a vast machine, a web of analysts, code breakers, and photo interpreters scattered from London to Cairo. Its strength was data. Its weakness was belief. Every image from the skies passed through the hands of experts at RAF Medmenham, the secret country house where photo interpreters pored over endless reels of film. They worked under magnifying lamps, comparing rooftops, shadows, and even tree lines across days or weeks. From these minute changes, they could predict troop movements or the build-up to an invasion. But they were also drowning in information. Tens of thousands of photographs arrived each week, and the Luftwaffe knew it. The Germans built decoy airstrips with perfect geometric precision, runways aligned to catch light correctly, fake aircraft casting convincing shadows. When bombed, these decoys would burn with controlled pyrotechnics, giving the illusion of success. For months, British planners believed they had neutralized entire fighter wings, only for the same squadrons to appear elsewhere days later. The enemy had learned that invisibility could be stronger than armor. Among the men frustrated by this deception was Flight Lieutenant Andrew Fletcher, the pilot with the paper map. He wasn't senior, nor famous. He flew reconnaissance sorties over France and the Low Countries, logging more hours above enemy territory than most bomber crews. His comrades called him the cartographer. Fletcher's habit was simple. After each flight, he sketched what he remembered while the details were fresh. Bridges, rivers, glints of metal. He marked where flak bursts had been heaviest, or where smoke drifted from the tree line. In an age when technology promised precision, his approach felt archaic, even eccentric. But one day, something on his sketches began to bother him. A series of faint clearings, irregular, half-hidden under forest canopy, always appeared near the same coordinates, though official maps showed nothing but wilderness. The soil patterns suggested disturbance. Tracks led in and out, ending abruptly at lines of trees. He brought his drawings to an intelligence debriefing, spreading them across the table before two officers from MI4, the branch responsible for geographic intelligence. They glanced at them, exchanged a quiet chuckle, and leaned back in their chairs. One of them said, "If there's an airfield there, Fletcher, it's invisible." "Exactly," Fletcher replied. The room fell silent. Invisible airfields. The very phrase sounded absurd, yet by 1943 it was a possibility the Allies couldn't ignore. The Germans had built entire bases under camouflage netting, sometimes using retractable hangars and tree-lined runways that blended seamlessly into the forest when viewed from altitude. Even advanced cameras could miss them if the pilot's angle or lighting was wrong. Still, no one was willing to divert resources based on a hand-drawn map. Fletcher's idea was logged as unverified. His sketch went into a file marked Unsubstantiated Intelligence, Region Southwest. But that night, Fletcher didn't sleep. He went back to his barracks, spread the same map across his bunk, and began refining it by lantern light. He added notes in the margins, compass bearings, altitude estimates, and guesses at the orientation of the supposed runway. If he was wrong, he'd waste a flight. If he was right, he might uncover the Luftwaffe's most guarded secret in Western Europe. Days later, bad weather grounded most missions. Clouds rolled over the channel, thick with sleet and wind. But Fletcher volunteered for a solo sortie the moment conditions cleared, requesting fuel for a direct run over the disputed area. His commanding officer hesitated. The region was known for heavy flak and unpredictable air patrols. Still, permission was granted. At dawn, Fletcher stood beside his Spitfire PR Mk-11, the unarmed reconnaissance variant, stripped for speed and range. No guns, no escort, only twin cameras behind the cockpit. On his knee board, secured under the straps, was his wrinkled, hand-drawn map, the one his comrades had laughed at over breakfast. They wished him luck with wry smiles. One joked, "Don't get lost in your artwork, Andy." He smiled back, but said nothing. As the sun rose, he climbed into the cockpit, strapped in, and felt the vibrations of the Merlin engine build to a steady roar. Frost melted from the wings as he taxied toward the runway. At 7:12 hours, Flight Lieutenant Andrew Fletcher took off into low cloud, heading south by southeast, toward a patch of land that officially didn't exist. To fly alone was to face silence more complete than death. At 30,000 feet, with the engine humming steady and the world turning white beneath, a reconnaissance pilot knew solitude like few others. There were no gunners, no radio chatter, only oxygen hiss, the ticking of instruments, and the rhythmic shudder of the fuselage. Every mission was a negotiation between nerve and instinct. Pilots like Fletcher were trained not to fight but to endure. A single mistake, a wrong heading, a cloud misjudged, could send them gliding blind over occupied territory, out of fuel, praying for a coastline. Reconnaissance pilots lived in the shadows of the war's fame. No medals for dogfights. No aces tallies. Their success was measured in inches of film and blurred shapes on negatives. Yet their flights determined where the bombers would strike and how many would return alive. In this quiet, analytical war, bravery wore a different face, not defiance, but precision. Fletcher's paper map wasn't just a theory. It was an act of faith in the human eye, in intuition against machinery. And that faith would soon be tested against one of the Luftwaffe's most sophisticated illusions: the tactical angle. By 1943, the Allied air strategy relied on the concept of air superiority by information. The goal wasn't just to destroy enemy aircraft, it was to destroy their capacity to launch. Every hidden hangar, every runway, every fuel depot mattered. But Germany's defenses were no longer static. Luftwaffe units moved swiftly across occupied territory, dispersing their aircraft into satellite fields, small, concealed bases designed to survive Allied bombing campaigns. Standard reconnaissance methods were failing. Traditional mapping assumed fixed structures, clear lighting, predictable geometry. But the Germans had learned to break those assumptions. They camouflaged runways with natural turf, extended roads for takeoffs, and parked planes under netting that mimicked tree canopies. From high altitude, the terrain appeared untouched, yet moments later, fighters would rise from the same forests to intercept bombers over France. To counter this, Allied reconnaissance needed more than cameras. It needed intuition, the ability to see what shouldn't be there. Subtle traces, parallel lines of soil compression, angled shadows, or the glint of sunlight off a buried fuel drum. That's what Fletcher's hand-drawn map represented. Not a guess, but the synthesis of hundreds of such minute observations. His brain had become a machine of deduction, plotting the invisible. If he was right, uncovering this airfield would expose a vital nerve in the Luftwaffe's western network, one that had cost the Allies countless airmen. If he was wrong, he'd be another name lost to a cloudy horizon. The technological angle. The aircraft Fletcher flew, the Spitfire PR-Mk11, was a paradox, an elegant killing machine turned into a lens. The guns were stripped out to save weight. The cockpit was unpressurized, forcing pilots to rely on oxygen at high altitudes. Cameras mounted in the fuselage operated on clockwork precision. F-24 aerial cameras capable of capturing detail from 25,000 feet with remarkable clarity. Film reels rolled silently as the aircraft passed over targets, clicking every few seconds. Each sortie produced hundreds of photographs, which ground crews would rush to darkrooms for development. Analysts then cross-referenced images to detect changes invisible to the naked eye. But even this sophisticated system had its limits. Light, angle, and weather could conceal everything. A single misalignment of shadow could make a runway vanish. Fletcher knew this better than anyone. That was why he trusted not only the camera's lens but his own judgment. The sweep of rivers, the arc of hills, the way light pooled differently across certain landscapes. Technology could record what was seen. Only human instinct could predict what was hidden. And sometimes, that difference meant victory or disaster. The enemy angle. Across the Channel, deep in the French countryside, Luftwaffe engineers and camouflage specialists worked relentlessly to make their fields vanish. These were not crude disguises, they were masterpieces of deception. Entire hangars were built with retractable roofs covered in sod and branches. Aircraft were rolled into underground shelters, engines warmed silently, ready to launch through narrow corridors of cleared forest. Fuel depots were disguised as barns. Ammunition stores were hidden in church crypts and farm sheds. Even German farmers were ordered to participate, plowing patterns designed to distort aerial photographs, laying straw to break up reflective surfaces. One of the Luftwaffe's camouflage officers, Oberst Lieutenant Franz Baum, famously remarked, "The best defense is to teach the earth to lie." This philosophy was working. Allied bombers were wasting sorties on empty fields, while real airfields continued to function unharmed. The Reich's Western Defense Line survived not by brute force, but by invisibility. And yet, as meticulous as their deception was, it depended on one assumption, that the enemy would keep looking down, not within, not between, but straight down from altitude. Fletcher wasn't looking down. He was tracing patterns laterally, connecting clues horizontally across terrain. His paper map didn't see France from above. It saw it as a living geography, breathing and moving. That small shift in perspective would soon expose the Luftwaffe's hidden airfield for what it was, not a myth, but a masterpiece of camouflage waiting to be undone. The leadership angle. Within the RAF's chain of command, logic ruled, or so it was believed. Each mission request passed through layers of authorization, weighed against fuel, risk, and potential intelligence value. By 1943, commanders were weary of individual initiative. The war had become one of procedure, not intuition. Yet this cautious structure often clashed with the instincts of men like Fletcher. Commanders sitting in map rooms in High Wycombe or London trusted reports from Medmenham's analysts, not sketches made by a single pilot. Orders had to be justified by numbers, not conviction. When Fletcher first presented his findings, his paper map, his annotated photographs, his request for a targeted recon flight, his senior officer hesitated. Not out of doubt in Fletcher's skill, but in fear of precedent. What if every pilot began chasing ghosts drawn on scraps of paper? But leadership in war often walks a fine line between control and faith. Some officers quietly admired Fletcher's persistence. He wasn't reckless, he was methodical, a man whose intuition was born from long observation. In the end, his mission was approved not because his map convinced the high command, but because they had no better lead. The Luftwaffe's ambushes were bleeding bomber groups dry. Someone had to find where those fighters were coming from. And if a single pilot with a paper map thought he could find it, so be it. That decision, small as it seemed, would ripple across the air war in Europe. The moral angle. Every reconnaissance flight carried an unspoken burden. The men in those cockpits knew their photographs would lead to destruction. A successful mission might mean thousands of bombs falling days later, factories flattened, convoys burned, airfields turned to ash. Fletcher understood this intimately. When his photographs confirmed a target, it set in motion the machinery of death, planners, navigators, and squadrons that would follow his trail of images back to the coordinates he'd marked. But there was a deeper tension beneath that duty. The Luftwaffe's hidden airfields weren't always isolated. Many were built near villages or along civilian farmland. Destroying them could mean killing those who had no choice but to live beside them. He'd once overheard a senior officer mutter, "You can't hide a war without hiding behind someone." For Fletcher, this mission was never about vengeance or glory. It was about clarity. If the enemy could hide their bases, then the very foundation of Allied air superiority was under threat. Yet with every discovery came the weight of what would follow. When he looked at his map, he didn't see just a target. He saw the invisible line between necessity and conscience, a line that, once crossed, no amount of precision could erase. And still, he drew. The psychological angle. Weeks of reconnaissance work left marks that no medal could measure. Pilots like Fletcher lived between adrenaline and exhaustion, flying at dawn, developing film by afternoon, briefing by night. The next day, it began again. Sleep came in fragments. The hum of engines haunted their dreams. Many smoked constantly, unable to silence their thoughts. The knowledge that they could be shot down at any moment, without guns, without defense, bred a strange calmness, a fatalistic poise. But Fletcher's calm was different. It bordered on obsession. His comrades noticed it, the way he'd stare at aerial photographs for hours, tracing faint lines with a pencil, muttering to himself about patterns in the soil. He spoke less, flew more, and kept refining the same map. Each mission added a new layer, a correction here, a road misaligned there. He was chasing something invisible, and each time he returned alive, his conviction grew stronger. This obsession isolated him. The laughter of his peers no longer stung. It became background noise. The only thing that mattered was proof, finding the hidden airfield and exposing it before more men died in ambushes. Psychologists later described this mindset as target fixation, a narrowing of thought so complete that the rest of the world fades. For Fletcher, it wasn't madness but purpose. The war had blurred the line between human intuition and mechanical analysis, and he stood at that crossroads. To doubt his own senses now would mean doubting the very thing keeping him alive. And so, even as storm clouds rolled across the channel, he prepared for another flight, one that would carry him deep into enemy airspace, guided by nothing but the trembling lines of a hand-drawn map. The men who saw him off that morning couldn't have known what his mission would uncover. To them, it was another sortie, another risk in a war full of them. But history would remember that flight as the moment when one man's conviction exposed the invisible. Then, one morning, his theory met its trial, and Europe's skies erupted. Into the white silence. March 3rd, 1943. RAF Benson. The ground crew moved briskly, their breath clouding in the cold morning air. A low ceiling of mist hung over the airfield, the kind that blurred the horizon and dulled sound. Fletcher climbed into the cockpit of his pale blue Spitfire PR Mk-11, his gloved hands methodically checking each switch and dial. The mission briefing had been brief and skeptical. His orders were simple: fly south over the Loire Valley, survey the area between Tours and Poitiers, return with film. Nothing more. But both he and his commanding officer knew the true purpose: to verify the map that had divided opinion across the unit. The Merlin engine came alive with a shuddering roar. Fletcher's oxygen mask hissed. He eased the throttle forward. The runway blurred beneath him, and within seconds, the Spitfire was climbing into the grey. Above 10,000 feet, the clouds broke open into brilliant sunlight. The world below became a shifting quilt of white, torn apart by ridges and rivers. Fletcher levelled out, consulting the small, creased paper map wedged under his clipboard strap. It wasn't pretty, a lattice of pencil lines, smudges, and small notes in the margins: possible clearing, flak north, road curve, unnatural. He trusted it more than any printed chart. The route took him across familiar landmarks: the Loire River like a silver vein, the faint ruins of a bombed bridge at Somme. He adjusted his heading slightly, following the course marked in his own handwriting: turn 15 degrees east after second bend. The altimeter read 28,000 feet. He was in German-controlled airspace now. Through the camera's viewing window, he could see nothing unusual, just farmland, forests, and frozen creeks. But then, faintly, something caught his eye. Two thin, parallel lines cutting across a clearing. Not roads. Too smooth. Too deliberate. He banked slightly, angling the camera for a better shot. The lines vanished under the glare of sun, then reappeared, extending into what looked like a patch of open ground concealed under camouflage netting. His pulse quickened. He began circling, wide, slow turns at altitude. Below him, something glimmered faintly in the haze. A shape, metallic, then gone. He adjusted the lens aperture and triggered the camera. The F-24 mechanism clicked rhythmically, spooling frame after frame. Each pass revealed more. Oil stains. Shadows of vehicles. The geometric outline of hangars, so faint they looked like ghosts. Then came the first burst of flak. Dark puffs erupted around the aircraft, black flowers blooming in the sky. Fletcher steadied the stick, adjusting altitude to 27,000. Another burst rocked the fuselage. The German gunners had seen him. But he didn't turn away. He tightened his path, diving slightly for better resolution. The field below was coming into focus. Not farmland, but a full-scale airbase, perfectly hidden beneath woven camouflage netting stretched between treetops. Dozens of aircraft, Messerschmitt Bf-109s, sat parked beneath it, their wings blending with the earth. Fletcher's camera clicked relentlessly. Each frame was evidence, proof carved into celluloid. Tracer fire streaked past his left wingtip. He pulled into a climb, banking hard. The Spitfire shuddered as flak detonated close beneath. For a moment, his vision blurred from the shockwave. He steadied his breathing. A final burst of photographs, one more pass, then he turned west, throttling up. As he broke through the upper layer of cloud, the light exploded around him. The noise of flak faded into the distance. His heart pounded, but his mind was calm. The camera reels in the fuselage now carried the truth, the proof of what his paper map had predicted. He set course for the Channel. Fuel was lower than planned, but he calculated he could make it back to England with 10 minutes to spare. He checked his compass, adjusted trim, and let the Spitfire glide smoothly on its return path. An hour later, the English coast came into view, a faint line of grey on the horizon. As he descended toward base, the adrenaline finally began to ebb, replaced by exhaustion. When he landed, the ground crew surrounded the aircraft immediately. The fuselage was pocked with flak shrapnel. Fletcher climbed out slowly, legs shaking slightly. In his hands, he carried the film canisters, still warm from the flight. He said only one thing to the intelligence officer waiting on the tarmac. "It's there." That evening, in a small darkroom at RAF Benson, red light bathed the walls. Photographers dipped the reels into chemical baths, the images slowly surfacing through the mist of developer. At first, they saw only shadows, then detail. Lines. Shapes. An unmistakable runway grid appeared. Hangars. Fuel tanks. Dozens of aircraft. The room fell silent. The base that did not exist had been found. The photographs reached RAF Medmenham within hours, carried in a sealed courier bag marked top secret. Inside the intelligence hall, magnifying lamps glowed like halos as analysts leaned over the prints. What they saw confirmed what many had refused to believe. The supposed farmland southwest of Châteauroux was, in fact, a major Luftwaffe forward operating base, complete with camouflaged hangars, refueling pits, and taxiways carved beneath forest canopies. The airfield had supported several JG-2 Richthofen fighter squadrons, which had been tormenting Allied bomber formations for months. In one frame, analysts identified 30 aircraft parked in concealed dispersal bays. Another image revealed fuel convoys snaking into the trees, covered by camo netting. The deception was brilliant, but no longer hidden. A coded signal went out that night to Bomber Command headquarters. Target confirmed. Priority strike authorized. For weeks, the Allied bombers had suffered heavy losses over western France. Now, at last, they had a location to strike. The operation was codenamed Mission Aldenham, after the estate where its discovery had been analyzed, a quiet nod to the irony of how a single pilot's map had redrawn a continent's worth of intelligence. March 6, 1943. 4:30 hours. In the freezing dark of a French morning, the hidden airfield stirred. German mechanics fueled aircraft under the dim glow of shielded lamps. Pilots of JG-2 prepared for another day's sorties. They believed themselves invisible. Above the English Channel, they were already being hunted. 2 waves of RAF Mosquitoes and Blenheims crossed the coast at low altitude, followed by a formation of B-26 Marauders of the USAF's 322nd Bomb Group. They flew in silence, radar-jammed, hugging the treetops. The lead navigator held a marked reconnaissance photo, Fletcher's image. The lines on his paper map had been replaced by clear coordinates, grid-referenced and verified. Every turn, every bend in the river, every hill crest matched the sketch drawn weeks before in pencil. At 6:17 hours, the first formation broke cloud cover. Ahead lay a forested plain, calm, untouched. Then the trees opened. From above, the hidden base revealed itself in sudden, horrifying clarity. Bomb doors opened. The first salvo of 500-pound bombs dropped through the mist, bursting through the camouflage nets like thunder tearing fabric. Fire rolled outward, igniting fuel drums, ammunition bunkers, and parked aircraft. The forest canopy became an inferno. German anti-aircraft guns roared to life too late. The precision of the Allied approach left little room to react. Secondary explosions rippled through the base, aviation fuel, ammunition stores, and the detonation of fully armed fighters still on the ground. Within minutes, the hidden airfield ceased to exist. Smoke rose thousands of feet into the sky, visible for miles, the very signal of destruction Fletcher's photographs had promised. The strike's success stunned Allied command. Subsequent reconnaissance flights confirmed near-total annihilation. More than 40 aircraft destroyed, hangars flattened, and one of the Luftwaffe's most secret strongholds reduced to ash. Reports from French resistance sources later verified that German command was thrown into disarray. The loss of that base disrupted operations across the Loire sector, forcing the Luftwaffe to retreat further east and scatter its remaining units. Back in England, Fletcher stood outside the intelligence hut as the report came in. The air was cold, misted with the smell of fuel and wet grass. He listened quietly as the results were read aloud, a tone of disbelief, even awe, among men who had once laughed at his child sketch. One officer turned to him and said simply, "You were right." Fletcher nodded, but said nothing. Vindication, in war, was always tempered by cost. The bombing raid had been effective, but not without casualties. 2 Mosquitoes failed to return. 1 Blenheim was lost to flak. Even victory carried its shadows. Later that night, as new film from the damage assessment was developed, Fletcher looked at the before and after images side by side. One showed the pristine illusion of a French woodland. The other, a scorched wound across the earth, hangers twisted, trees burned to ash. His paper map, now creased and oil-stained, lay folded in his flight log. On the corner, written in pencil, were 3 words. Confirmed by fire. In London, senior officers of the Air Ministry took note. Fletcher's discovery was no longer an anecdote. It became a precedent. Intelligence divisions across the Allied network were ordered to incorporate pilot sketches and hand-drawn annotations as official intelligence supplements. The human element, intuition, memory, pattern recognition, was no longer secondary to machine analysis. For the first time, the RAF formally acknowledged that the eye of a pilot could perceive what even the sharpest lens might miss. Fletcher was recommended for the Distinguished Flying Cross. His name, however, remained classified for decades. Reconnaissance pilots rarely became public heroes. Their victories existed in silence, measured not by headlines but by the shifting of front lines. A few weeks later, another mission took him back over the same region. He looked down through the canopy of clouds. The forest below was blackened, the hidden base erased. Where once the enemy had hidden in plain sight, there was now only smoke and ruin and silence. He banked the aircraft gently, turned north, and began the long flight home. By dawn, the smoke curled upward, marking the end of a secret base and the beginning of a new phase of the air war. The ripples of a hidden victory. The raid on the Châteauroux airfield lasted less than 10 minutes. Yet its consequences rippled across Europe for months. For the Luftwaffe, the loss was not just material, it was psychological. The base had been a cornerstone of their deception network, one of several phantom strongholds used to project air power far greater than their true capacity. Hidden among forests and valleys, these fields allowed German fighters to launch sudden interceptions and then vanish into the countryside before Allied reconnaissance could locate them again. Its destruction shattered the illusion. Intercepted radio transmissions in the following weeks revealed frantic orders from Oberkommando der Luftwaffe. OKL camouflage procedures were to be revised, aircraft dispersal increased, and operational secrecy tightened. But beneath the bureaucratic urgency was something else: fear. If one hidden base could be found, none were truly safe. The Allied intelligence community sensed this immediately. Analysts at RAF Medmenham began reviewing thousands of existing photographs through a new lens, no longer trusting surface appearances. They re-examined faint tire tracks, subtle shifts in tree-line geometry, and minute discolorations in farmland. Every anomaly could now suggest something concealed. The method worked. Within weeks, analysts identified at least 5 additional hidden or partially camouflaged Luftwaffe facilities across occupied France and Belgium. Each was marked, confirmed, and bombed in turn. Fletcher's paper map had done more than reveal one target. It had changed the way the Allies hunted the invisible. For RAF Coastal Command and the US 8th Air Force, the timing was crucial. By spring 1943, Allied bombers were preparing for a full-scale offensive over Western Europe. To succeed, they needed to suppress German fighter bases capable of launching intercepts. Every airfield destroyed meant fewer German squadrons ready to defend their industrial heartland. In that context, Fletcher's discovery became a silent cornerstone of a larger strategy. It was logged under the heading Operational Intelligence Breakthrough, Field Observation Cross-Verification. The bureaucratic phrasing concealed its true impact, the validation of instinct over instrument. Within the RAF, a quiet doctrinal shift followed. Flight debriefings, once seen as routine, became critical sessions. Pilots were encouraged to report anything odd or inconsistent, no matter how small. Intelligence officers began to collect not just photographs and radio intercepts, but stories, human observations that could fill the gaps between data points. A generation of pilots learned that sometimes victory began not with a camera, but with a sketch on paper. The Luftwaffe tried to recover. Replacement aircraft and supplies were diverted from bases near Paris and Reims. But the strategic damage was deeper than any count of destroyed machines. The German fighter network along the Loire had relied on synchronized timing, overlapping patrol routes and refueling points hidden within range of one another. The loss of Châteauroux fractured that web. When the US 8th Air Force launched its next series of daylight raids on rail targets across western France, interception rates dropped dramatically. Reports from bomber crews noted fewer enemy contacts, slower response times, and reduced anti-aircraft coordination. To most, it was just one of many small victories in a grinding air war. But to those who understood its origins, it was the echo of a single pilot's determination to trust his eyes over his instruments. Fletcher himself remained largely anonymous. His name did not appear in newspapers or dispatches. He continued flying reconnaissance missions through late 1943, contributing to the build-up for Operation Overlord, D-Day. He often carried his map notebook, though it had long since been filled. By then, Fletcher maps, as they were jokingly called among his peers, had become an unofficial tradition, hand-drawn overlays kept alongside official navigation charts. Pilots believed they brought luck. Intelligence officers saw them as one more set of eyes. It was a small, almost invisible legacy, but one that quietly endured. From a smudged sheet of paper, the shape of the war had shifted. But the consequences, both human and strategic, were still unfolding across skies that had yet to burn. Shadows behind the smoke. The smoke from Châteauroux lingered long after the last Allied bomber had returned to England. On the ground, the forests bore scars, charred earth, twisted metal, and the faint acrid smell of burning fuel that would linger for weeks. German engineers had attempted to repair the damage, but the base was lost. Intelligence reports noted the tactical impact immediately. German fighter patrols over central France decreased, forcing command to consolidate aircraft closer to urban centers. Luftwaffe sorties became slower, less coordinated, and more predictable. For Allied bomber crews, the skies were marginally safer, a difference measured not just in destroyed planes, but in human lives spared. Yet the human cost of reconnaissance remained high. Pilots like Fletcher faced repeated exposure to flak, adverse weather, and the constant risk of interception. Losses continued in other sectors. The RAF recorded dozens of reconnaissance casualties during 1943. For every hidden base discovered, a pilot risked becoming a statistic. Among the intelligence officers analyzing Fletcher's photographs, a quiet realization took hold. War was no longer fought solely with bombs or bullets. Observation, painstaking, patient, human observation, had become equally decisive. The paper map method was incorporated into training for reconnaissance and photographic intelligence units. Pilots were encouraged to note patterns, anomalies, and intuition, creating a hybrid of machine-assisted and human-guided intelligence. Even years later, the mission served as a case study in intelligence circles. Historians would later note that Fletcher's flight helped demonstrate that the Luftwaffe's camouflage, while brilliant, could be systematically defeated when human pattern recognition was combined with photographic technology. His work indirectly influenced operations leading up to Operation Overlord, where the identification of hidden German fortifications became critical. The Germans, meanwhile, attempted to adjust. Camouflage techniques evolved. New airfields were constructed with even greater attention to detail, often dispersed or hidden in smaller, less detectable clusters. But the principle had been established. No field, no matter how well hidden, was invulnerable to the combined power of observation, experience, and determination. Fletcher's paper map, initially dismissed as amateurish, became a symbol within the RAF of the value of individual insight in a war increasingly dominated by technology. Pilots who once mocked hand-drawn sketches began to rely on them, using them as overlays on aerial photographs to detect subtle inconsistencies. What had been an eccentric habit was now tacitly recognized as operational gold. For Fletcher, recognition was quiet and understated. He continued flying, his bravery measured not in medals or headlines, but in missions completed and lives indirectly saved. His name remained classified for decades, a ghost of history whose deeds only surfaced in archival reports long after the war. The paper map itself survived as a legend within intelligence circles. Analysts, historians, and educators would later refer to it when illustrating the critical interface between human intuition and machine analysis. It became a reminder that in war, small acts of observation, a line drawn in pencil, a moment of quiet attention, could shift the trajectory of conflict. By the summer of 1943, the Loire Valley had become significantly less dangerous for Allied air crews. Fletcher's discovery had not only destroyed a key Luftwaffe base but also established a pattern for locating others. Reconnaissance missions became more methodical, deliberate, and informed. The combination of photographic analysis and pilot-led observation accelerated the identification of hidden infrastructure across occupied Europe. Yet for Fletcher, the true reward was intangible. He had trusted his instincts over skepticism, risked his life for a line on a map, and in doing so, exposed a secret that had eluded entire intelligence departments. History would eventually record the consequences: the destroyed base, the shift in Allied tactics, the lives spared, but the quiet courage of one man remained largely invisible. And so, every victory left its trace, not just on maps, but on minds. The hidden airfield was gone, but the lesson endured. Sometimes, human intuition could pierce even the most meticulous disguise of war. The map that changed the sky. In war, maps are often treated as lifeless grids, numbers, lines, coordinates. Yet sometimes, a map is more than ink and paper. For Flight Lieutenant Fletcher, it was a vessel of intuition, a bridge between human perception and the chaos of battle. His hand-drawn sketches had defied skepticism, exposed a hidden airfield, and reshaped the Allied understanding of the Luftwaffe's camouflage. In doing so, they revealed a timeless truth: war is not fought by machines alone, nor by brute force. It is also fought by minds that see patterns where others see only disorder. The destruction of the hidden base altered the tactical map of Europe. Fighter interceptions declined, bomber losses fell, and the Allies gained a precious advantage. Yet the impact was measured not only in strategy or numbers, but in lives spared, in missions made safer, in a subtle shift of momentum invisible to the front pages of newspapers. Fletcher's story is also a lesson in courage, the quiet, patient courage that does not roar in victory parades, but persists in small, relentless acts of conviction. One pilot's insistence on following a pencil line through clouds, wind, and enemy fire became a catalyst for change. It demonstrated that human insight can pierce even the most sophisticated deceptions, that instinct can complement technology, and that a single perspective can illuminate truths others overlook. Decades later, as archives opened and reconnaissance records were declassified, Fletcher's flights became case studies in military schools. Analysts examined his methods, pilots learned from his diligence, and historians admired the subtle interplay between intellect and intuition. The paper map endured as a symbol of vision, of resolve, and of the delicate, invisible threads connecting observation to outcome in war. Ultimately, the story of a hidden airfield, of smoke rising from trees and hangars, is not just about destruction. It is about discovery, about the human mind daring to trust itself against the impossible. It reminds us that even in the vast machinery of war, individual insight can bend the course of events, leaving a mark not just on maps, but on history itself. And in that quiet truth lies the enduring power of one man's paper map.